It's my privilege this morning to introduce the one who will be preaching and teaching at this hour and also the 1 o'clock hour. That is our brother Michael Windham. If you weren't here for class, you missed a special class. It was a very good class, outstanding. Brother Michael led us through Psalm 88, teaching some very practical and powerful truths from that context. Michael is a second-year student at the Brown Trail School of Preaching. He is set to graduate this December. He is also a member of the Christian Care Center congregation in Mesquite. And before Michael came to Brown Trail, he practiced law for 14 years, and for 4 years he was a judge in Dallas County. So that explains the aura of distinction, surrounding Brother Michael. We appreciate him for many, many reasons. His humility. I told you in class I had to draw out almost by force those last facts about his practicing law and, again, being a judge. He didn't want that to be the focal point of today by any stretch of the imagination. So I appreciate his humility. I appreciate very much his deep desire to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. So Michael came from, practicing the law of the land to preaching the law of Christ. And I'm thankful that he's doing just that. This morning, he is going to be leading us in a study entitled, Get Behind Me, Satan. I know it'll be a profitable study for each and every one of us, so let's all pay attention as he preaches the word.
Good morning. It's good to be with you this morning. I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate Brother Ken Hope. He's always very encouraging to us. I get a lot out of my time with him, and I know you benefit from your time with him. My understanding is he never goes over 2 hours, so I figure if I can keep it to an hour and a half, then I'm going to be golden. Okay. We're going to look this morning at an incident between Jesus and Peter. Before we get there, I'd like to review for a few minutes the history between Jesus and Peter so that we can understand when this incident happens, how much Peter knew about Jesus, what their relationship was, what Peter's understanding was. So we'll make reference to a couple of passages. We'll look at a couple of passages. In John chapter 1, Andrew and John, who would go on to become apostles, were disciples of John the Baptizer. And they hear what John says about Jesus, that he is the Lamb of the world, the come Messiah. And so they follow him, they get to know him. And Andrew, in his excitement about this, goes to tell his brother Simon. John chapter 1, let's notice John chapter 1 beginning with verse 40. One of the two who heard John speak and followed Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," Hebrew, which means Christ, Greek, the anointed one, the prophet, priest, and king who was prophesied. Verse 42, he brought Peter to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "So you are Simon the son of John, you shall be called Cephas," which means Peter. So Andrew brings Peter to Jesus. Jesus gives him that name, Peter. And Peter already knows that Jesus is held out to be the Messiah, the promised one who was to come. Luke chapter 5, Jesus is teaching. There's a crowd, as often was the case. And to give himself some breathing space and some order to the proceedings, Jesus gets into a boat, gets into Peter's boat. Luke chapter 5, verse 3, asks Peter to go out a little bit from the land. Jesus teaches the crowd. And in verse 4, when Jesus had finished speaking, he said to Simon, who was a fisherman by profession, put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. And Simon answered, Master. So he's recognizing already who Jesus is. Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. He's a professional fisherman. He knows how this works. He's been trying. The fish they're not cooperating. An experience common to fishermen. But nonetheless, because Jesus wants him to do so, he agrees. But at your word, I will let down the nets. When they'd done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They can't hold all the fish that they hadn't been able to catch until now. They signaled to their fishing partners, James and John. They come over with their boat, and now both boats have more fish than they can handle. Both boats, the end of verse 7, begin to sink. Notice Peter's reaction. Luke 5 and verse 8. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. He recognizes he whose presence he's in. He recognizes his power, and that causes him to recognize his own sin. And he's fearful. He knows that he shouldn't be as close to God, or feels that he shouldn't be as close to God as he is. Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. Verse 10, Jesus tells him, do not be afraid. God's power is not something to fear, something to draw us to him. So he tells Simon Peter, do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men. And Peter becomes a disciple of Jesus. Peter would witness great miracles as a disciple of Jesus. He would see the healing of his mother-in-law, the instant healing of his mother-in-law from a great fever in Mark chapter 1, verses 29 to 31. He would witness the raising from the dead of Jairus' daughter, Luke 8:51. On that occasion, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, suggesting the beginning of that close relationship. And then notice Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14, beginning with verse 26. This was another occasion where Jesus had been teaching, and afterward he goes up on a mountain by himself to pray. The disciples are crossing the Sea of Galilee, and there's a strong wind, and they're not really making any progress. Night falls, and Jesus comes to them on the water. Notice Mark 14, verse 26. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, it is a ghost. And they cried out in fear. Again, that reaction to his power. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. And brave Peter, verse 28. Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. He said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. For a while, Peter gets to walk on water. He sees the storm, he begins to doubt, he begins to fear, he begins to sink. He cries out to Jesus to save him. Verse 31, Jesus takes his hand, takes hold of him and says, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And then Jesus and Peter get into the boat, and the storm stops. The wind stops. That which had been halting their progress all night long is gone instantly. And notice their reaction. Verse 33. Those in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. So when we come to the incident that's the basis for our study this morning, Peter knows that Jesus is the Messiah. He knows that Jesus has miraculous power up to and including healing the dead and controlling nature. He knows that Jesus is worthy of worship. He knows that Jesus is the Son of God. That brings us to Mark chapter 8. This incident is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We will primarily be looking at Mark's account. It's also in Matthew 16 and Luke 9. We're going to begin at verse 27 of Mark 8. Mark 8 and verse 27. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do the people say that I am?" They're going along, and the teacher tests the students. By the way, we get tested every week by a teacher who is sitting in the crowd whose initials I will not name. But the teacher's testing the students, and he asks, "Who do people say that I am?" And of course, it's just, what are people saying? What's the talk? What have you heard? And so everybody chimes in with an answer. Verse 28, and they told him, John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. All, here's the report, all the talk about Jesus. Verse 29, and he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Who do you say that I am? Now he's put them on the spot. Don't just tell me what you've heard, tell me what you think. Take a stand. And now it's not everybody who wants to answer. But Peter does. Peter answered him, "You are the Christ. You are the Son of the living God." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. This confession, Matthew 16, Jesus said, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." And upon that truth, that confession that he was the Christ, would be the rock that the church would be built upon. Something about this confession, something about perhaps the timing as his death was approaching, this changes Jesus' approach to teaching them. They've hit a plateau, and now it's time to do some deeper teaching. So we come to verse 31 of Mark 8. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. Jesus had taught that the temple would be torn down and in 3 days raised again. There was a figurative way that he had taught this. Now he's teaching this plainly. He's got to suffer. He's going to be rejected. The leaders of the people are going to have him killed. And no longer couched in the figurative language, they're starting to understand something of this. Tells them plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Let me say a word in defense of Peter here. Ultimately, his behavior is not defensible, but it is understandable. Put yourself in his shoes for a minute. You are following the Son of God. You've seen him raise the dead. You've seen him control storms. You've heard teaching like you've never heard before, with power and authority. You've seen love like you've never seen before. You've witnessed humility like you've never witnessed it before. He's popular. He's so popular to fight off the crowds, he's got to get in a boat and go out in the water. He's got to go out in the wilderness to be by himself so that he can pray. He's popular, he's powerful, he's young, he's in the prime of life. He's strong. And he's talking about dying. And This doesn't seem to be a one-time event, 31. He began to teach them. This is something he kept on teaching so that they would get it. So Jesus continues to talk about how he's going to die. This popular, all-powerful Son of God is talking about how the people are going to turn and kill him, and that's not going to be stopped. If you heard a young, healthy, popular person who seemed to have everything talking over and over again about how they were going to die, what would you think? Undoubtedly, Peter and the apostles discussed this among themselves. We'll see evidence of that in just a minute. But Peter practices what Jesus taught. You know, Matthew 18, your brother sins against you. Not that Jesus had sinned against Peter, but you've got a problem with your brother, you go talk to him one-on-one. If you can't settle that, then you escalate it from there. Peter practices that. He takes Jesus aside and, as is said here, begins to rebuke him. Now, our understanding of that word rebuke makes it sound very harsh, like Jesus is lording it over Peter and wagging his finger at him and getting on to him. But Matthew's account in Matthew 16, verse 22, tells us what Peter said in rebuke on this occasion. Peter takes Jesus aside and says, "Far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you." Peter doesn't come out and get on to Jesus the way we would think of it. What Peter tells Jesus is, "Lord, you're going to be fine. Everything's going to be okay. This isn't going to happen. You're popular. The people love you. You're the Son of God. Nobody can stand against you. It's going to be fine. Far be it from you." How many of us in Peter's shoes would have said the exact same thing? Verse 33. But turning and seeing his disciples, Jesus turns and the other apostles, they're listening in on this. They're very interested in this, which is why I suspect that they'd been talking about this among themselves. They had an idea what Peter was doing. They're very interested in what's going on. And so Jesus, seeing them, teaches them a lesson. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan." I can imagine Peter probably would have rather Jesus had hauled off and hit him in the gut as to say something like that. He calls him the personal name of the adversary. "Get behind me, Satan." Now, did Peter think he was doing the work of Satan? No. Peter's intentions were good. He thought he was honoring his master. He was trying to help. He was trying to comfort. He was trying to reassure. He was trying to do the right thing as best he knew, as best he saw it, and he was absolutely wrong. He was contradicting the plain teaching of God. He was, well-intentioned as he may have been, substituting his own judgment for God's. And in so doing the devil's work. "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Peter put his own opinion ahead of Jesus' teaching. He thought he knew better. Verse 34. Now Jesus decides to use this occasion not just to teach the apostles, but to teach the people more broadly. And he called to him the crowd with his disciples. and said to them, the passage that was read for us at the beginning of the service, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself." Peter was elevating himself above what Jesus had taught, above what Jesus had said, above God's revealed plan. He was not, in that instance, denying himself. "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." There is difficulty, there is suffering at times in following Jesus. We spoke about that some in the class this morning. And follow him. Submission. Not putting our will first, but his. Verse 35, "For whoever would save his life will lose it." If we're trying so hard to run the show, if we're trying so hard to take control, that we deny God's authority, that we deny his lordship, we lose. We lose our lives. We lose our souls. But whoever loses his life, submits, recognizes God as the authority, as Peter should have done on this occasion. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his life? Things of this life ultimately are temporary. The eternal is what matters. The eternal is what is important. The eternal is what we must hold on to. Verse 37, "For what can a man give in return for his life?" We're incapable of paying the price for our souls. Thankfully, our Lord did. Verse 38, "For whoever is ashamed of me." Now, if you asked Peter in this moment, was he ashamed of Jesus? I suspect his answer would have been absolutely not. But that's not how he was acting. He was ashamed of what Jesus had been teaching. We've got a whole world, we've got a whole society, a whole culture, a whole country that works mightily hard to shame us into silence, into agreeing with what is false, into just tolerating what is false, what is ungodly. "Whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation." By the way, adulterous and sinful generations aren't new to us. "Whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Peter put his own thinking first. He put his own will first. That wasn't, if you asked him at the time, was that his intention? I suspect he would say no. He was trying to help. He was trying to do the right thing. He was trying to help Jesus. There are people who say they're trying to help Jesus who aren't, because they're denying his plain teaching, putting their own thinking above God's command, above God's will. In Matthew 16, this same context, Matthew adds this statement in verse 27. "For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done." There are consequences for disobedience. There are consequences for rejection of him, for shame of him. If we try to hold on to ourselves too strongly, putting ourselves over him, we lose our souls. If we lose our life for his sake, if we submit to him, we find it. This moment between Jesus and Peter, this statement, "Get behind me, Satan," it wasn't a permanent change in the relationship. Peter learned his lesson. He learned what he needed to learn. He remained faithful and followed, imperfectly at times, but he remained faithful. Just 6 days later, at the beginning of Mark chapter 9, he would be again part of the inner circle with Peter, James and John as Jesus took them up on the Mount of Transfiguration. That close relationship continued. But for it to continue, this was a lesson Peter needed to learn. Let's take a look at Romans chapter 8. And we'll close with this. Romans chapter 8, beginning with verse 5. Romans 8, beginning with verse 5, Paul wrote this: "For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh." Now again, would Peter have thought that's what he was doing? No, but it is. It is what he was doing. Putting his own thinking above God's thinking. "For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit." Having a godly disposition, having a godly mind is not something that just happens. It is purposeful selection. We choose to put our mind on the things of God. We set our minds upon Him. Verse 6, "To set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. For the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God." Again, would Peter have said he was being hostile? No. Was he? Yes. "Get behind me, Satan." When we set our minds on the things of the flesh, when we put our own thinking above God's, we're being hostile to Him. For it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. The opposite of hostility in this context is our submission, our recognizing Him as Lord. Verse 8, "Those who are in the flesh cannot please God." If that's our thinking, if that's where we stay, we don't please Him. And we don't have eternity. We must want to submit. We must want to please our Lord. And after all, why wouldn't we? Because of His great sacrifice for us. It may be this morning that you're not a Christian. You can become one. Believing in Him, confessing faith in Him, repenting of sin, turning away from self, denying self, following Him, and putting Him on in the waters of baptism, you can become a child of God this very morning. It may be that you've wandered away, that you have put your own thinking above God's and shown Him hostility, perhaps even well-meaning, but you've wandered away from Him. You can come back to Him, repenting of sin and praying for forgiveness. We stand ready to help you in any way that we can. If you need to respond to the invitation of the gospel, won't you please come as together we stand and sing.